Hi, it's Miss Pitzel at the Upper West Library, and I am book talking Dark Sky Rising, Reconstruction, and the Dawn of Jim Crow. And it's by Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Tanya Bolden. Henry Louis Gates Jr. he's a professor at Harvard, but he also does the TV series on PBS called Finding Your Roots. So this is his first book for YA young adults, and is written with Tanya Bolden because she is a young adult nonfiction writer. All right, so this is nonfiction history, and wow, I have like 2 pages of notes from reading this book because it is just packed. It is not a long book. There are a ton of pictures. You can probably tell by all the black in this instead of it all being white. All right, or gray. So even though the title kind of presumes that it deals with everything after the Civil War, which it does, the first fourth of the book is about African Americans and their fight to fight with the North in the Civil War because they weren't automatically given the right to fight. so about maybe not the fourth, maybe the first fifth of the book is about their fight to be able to fight with the North, become soldiers for the North, and fight for their rights and freedom. They were actually 20% of our Navy, African Americans, and plus there were even more African Americans who just went along with Northern troops and did cooking for them and spying for them and scouting and guiding for them. I do like that they, at the very end of that section, they looked at 3 women, specifically African American women who made major contributions to the war effort, and one of them was Elizabeth Bauer. She actually was a spy in Jefferson Davis's White House, so the Southern White House, and she was very, very important to the North. All right, then the Civil War ends, and what we call the period of Reconstruction begins. Now, Reconstruction would probably be different because, as you may know, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated not long after Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. That wasn't the official end of the war, but it was basically the end of the war. And his vice president was Andrew Johnson. It's important. You need to know, because it's confusing. I remember this revelation when I was a teenager. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. So the Republicans were the ones who wanted the South to pay for the war and wanted to punish the South. And then there were Democrats, and especially Southern Democrats. Yeah, they kind of wanted to keep the status quo. So Andrew Johnson was actually a Democrat. Abraham Lincoln had him as his running mate because he kind of needed him in order to win the second election. So Andrew Johnson succeeds Abraham Lincoln, and because of that, Reconstruction is a fiasco. He doesn't want to call it Reconstruction, he wants to call it reunion, and he basically says, against the will of Congress, he basically says, I'm not sure it would have been okay, actually, it was a mess. Let's just say that. But he says, hey, a state can come back in full standing as long as they rescind their secession declarations and adopt the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. So basically, the South gets to go on, most of the South gets to go on status quo as if things were back to normal, except African Americans weren't slaves. So some African Americans did flourish, but many did not. They were uneducated, couldn't read. Sharecropping was a huge issue, which you basically, the master, because they had laws written where you still had to call him master if you worked for them, would keep these people indebted to them, and so they were still working as if they were slaves. And it also kept African American children from going to school. So they did establish something called the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a government agency intended to help slaves after the Civil War, but it was Andrew Johnson's policies decimated the power of that government agency. So it was a government agency that really had no power to do anything. So I have to say a quote from this, that was actually a quote from somebody else, but they were talking about Andrew Johnson's policies. They said, the southern states became subjugated, my words, to the North. So they were subject to the North, but yet unconverted rebels, meaning the attitudes in the South didn't change, and they didn't want things to change. So yes, slavery was abolished, but that didn't mean things changed. So this talks about things that I wouldn't think about. African Americans who were trying to locate their families because their families had been sold off during slavery, and they didn't know where they were. There was we know about the Tulsa massacre now, but we didn't know about it then. That didn't happen during Reconstruction. But there was a Memphis massacre where 46 African American adults and children were murdered. Over 100 homes were burnt. At least 70 more were injured. They burned 12 schools, a number of black churches. So this violence was just continuing to go on. Like I said, I've got 2 pages of notes. Can't reach everything. I didn't know there were so many civil rights acts. There were several civil rights acts passed after Reconstruction. We only think about the one that was passed in the 60s. So the people in Congress hated Andrew Johnson. They tried to impeach him. They lost by 1 vote, which once again empowered the Southern Democrats who wanted to keep the status quo. All right. There were white Republicans down in the South trying to do things to help African Americans, and they were being harassed and murdered as well. And over the course of many years, the Republicans just got tired of Reconstruction, and so they kind of let things, they just kind of we're done. Okay, we're done. And then what happens is a lot of these southern states, Missouri was the first one, rewrote their constitutions to put in place things like poll taxes, which kept poor African Americans and poor white Americans from voting. $2 was a lot of money back then to be able to vote. You shouldn't have to pay to vote. And then also literacy tests, which a lot of these people didn't have schooling, so they weren't literate. And so the literacy test you might get as an African American versus a white American would be different. So and then other states followed suit. So things... It talks about African Americans, like Kansas got a big surge of African American communities because one leader led a bunch of people, thousands of people to Kansas. But not everybody could just get up and leave. They literally had so little. They talked about Plessy versus Ferguson, Ida B. Wells, who was a female African American reporter and investigator. It talks about it ends with the creation of the NAACP, which is the National Association, I forget what the other A is, of colored people. But there's 2 A's, and I forget what the second A is. But that came about as the result of white violence, meaning whites against blacks, in Springfield, Illinois. So this happened in the North, and people are like, wait, and that's kind of where this ends. It's like the creation of the NAACP, which still exists today. So I learned so much. I did not know. I knew next to nothing about Reconstruction. I knew more about the Civil War, very little about Reconstruction, and I'm not even sure if what I learned was really true, or what I remember was really true. It's a short book, like I said, but so much in it and this is one of the reasons why it's hard for me to read nonfiction, is because I'm a slow reader, and sometimes I had to find myself having to go back and reread things, so I made sure I understood them, which is also a reason why I take notes, especially if I'm reading a nonfiction book. But I do recommend this. There are a lot of people out there who will only read nonfiction, so I'm glad I read it. It was a life's education in an era which I knew very little about. All right. If this is not your cup of tea, I really understand that. If this is not your cup of tea, I will help you find something else. Have a fantastic day and keep on reading.